Well, just to follow the trend of John in the last few weeks, let me start with the words of a song. Australian hip-hop group Hilltop Hoods sing, "The more I want, then the less I'm free. So when I see everything I've got, that's enough for me. That's enough for me. That's enough for me. It's all I need." They are singing about our culture of always wanting more. And this idea that if I only have more than I currently have, I'll be satisfied. Which, as their song points out, is not only a lie, but it perpetuates a kind of slavery to the pursuit of bettering whatever situation I'm currently in. This is where Paul goes in this passage that we're looking at today. In this chapter, he's been speaking about marriage and singleness. If you haven't heard the last few weeks, you can go back and get the context of this. And he'll continue this discussion in the passage following. Some people see this passage today as a change in direction of what he is saying, but in fact, we find that he is coming to the crux of his argument when he is teaching about these things. And what he is saying is that we should not try to change the status that we had when we became a Christian. And his point is that the more I try to control my situation, the less I'm free to be a disciple in the place that I'm in. Look at what he says. "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches." Paul will go on to say this same thing 2 more times in this passage, interspersed with 2 aspects of their culture to help illustrate what he's saying in his bigger discussion about marriage and singleness. So look at what he does. After first telling them to focus on living their own life in their unique situation, he uses an illustration of circumcision in verses 18 and 9, and then he says effectively the same thing in verse 20. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And then he uses another example of slavery in verses 21 to 23 before saying the same thing again in verse 24. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. The central idea, and this is what I want to say today in one sentence, the best place to learn to live the life of a disciple is right where you are now. And so to explore this idea, I want firstly to look at how Paul uses these 2 examples of circumcision and slavery to make his point within the bigger context of a discussion about marriage and singleness. And then secondly, to think about how we apply these ideas to ourselves. So first, Paul uses this example of their situation based on ethnic status. And he says that they shouldn't try to change ethnic status in order to pursue God's call. He says, was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. What Paul's talking about here is a social pressure that some people in the community may have felt in the surrounding culture, or even maybe in the church. It was normal practice, of course, in ancient Corinthian society, as it was across Greek as a whole in the ancient world, to exercise and go to the gymnasium and baths naked, amongst other men. And they'd spend their time exercising naked and then relaxing in the baths naked. So presumably, many Jewish men felt the pressure to conform to social norms and pretend to be Gentiles so they didn't get ridiculed in the public baths. And some would have surgery to look as if they were uncircumcised. And then on the other hand, some Gentile men who became Christians felt that maybe in order to fit in better at church, where there were many Jews, and who they probably went to the baths with, they should become circumcised. Paul says, undergoing an operation to restore your foreskin may advance your social standing by avoiding ridicule, but it doesn't count for anything before God. And undergoing circumcision may make you feel more socially accepted at church, but it does nothing to make you a true son of Abraham. He says, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. That is a radical thing for a Jew to say, that circumcision is nothing, because this was the very mark of being part of God's people for the Jews. But Paul is saying here, don't be swayed by social pressures of the day to decide what you'll do or how you'll live. Because being called to Christ means that worth based on ethnicity no longer counts. That in Jesus you have all the social status you could ever get. So why would you need to change your current social standing? Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. And then Paul moves on to a second example, thinking about their social status in relation to slavery. He says, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you, although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. For some of us, when reading passages that talk about slavery in the Bible, we can feel uneasy that slavery was part of society and accepted, and that Paul doesn't seem to speak directly against it. There's a few things for us to note when reading a passage like this. First, there was a variety of types of slavery in ancient times. And while there is good evidence that slavery could be violent and demeaning in the ancient world, there's also much evidence that many slaves were treated very fairly and lived a far better life as a slave than when they were freed. In a place like Corinth, which was very conscious of social status, only if a free person didn't care about honour would they treat slaves unfairly, because it was a public honour to treat them well. It's also important to recognise that in both ancient Jewish and Roman times, a person might become a slave as an intentional decision, to escape poverty, for example, or to pay off a debt, because there were no social services and no bankruptcy system, so it could be a way of providing security for a family. But someone also might become a slave involuntarily, by birth, by being captured in battle, or as a sentence for a crime. In Corinth, the idea of slavery was primarily used for someone who was bound to serve their master for a specific period of time, which is why the ESV translates the word doulos, which is the common word for slave, as bondservant. A bondservant is someone who serves their master in a profession for a standard wage, such as a childminder, or a teacher, or a doctor, or a civil servant, or as a skilled tradesperson. These people didn't have the freedom to change jobs or to change employee, but they could save money and might even own property of their own, and generally at some stage they were either released or they purchased their freedom. Historians suggest that the average period of time a person was a bondservant was about 7 years. The idea of slavery that we might have in our mind, where a person is held against their will at a threat of violence for life, is not the general picture of slavery in Corinth. The reality is that in the Corinthian population at this time, estimates suggest that a third of the population were slaves. A third were former slaves who were now freed, and a third were freeborn. So this is an aspect of life that lies at the very centre of the way the ancient society works. The fact that today we're able to see that it's an evil idea that one person could own another person makes, as we'll see, what Paul says here really interesting. And so when Paul talks about slavery, first we need to see that Paul is not trying to make a comment about slavery, but he uses normal social practice as an illustration for how a person should approach the situations they find themselves in life, particularly in the case regarding marriage and singleness. And secondly, we can see that while he's not trying to directly fight against slavery, he knows that would be counterproductive. He does speak about it in a way that will eventually, but subversively, lead to its downfall. One place that we can see this is by examining what he's saying in verse 21. There is a considerable question around how we should read the second verse of verse 21. It reads, "Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you." And then it says this, "If you are able to become free," and here's the question, does it say rather or by all means, make use of it? There's considerable discussion about what Paul is suggesting that person make use of here. On the one hand, an optimistic reading assumes that Paul's encouraging the pursuit of freedom from slavery if that comes about. Like most modern versions, like our NIV or ESV, this reading sets what Paul is saying within the context of marriage and singleness and sees Paul making the point that there are advantages of being free, just as there are advantages of being single, which he'll say in verse 26. The point he's making is that these advantages have nothing to do with a person standing before God, and so not to worry about the situation you're in, but pursue freedom if it's available. At the other end, a pessimistic reading assumes that Paul is saying that you should make the most of your position as a slave, like the New Jerusalem Bible. People who choose this reading or think this is what the text is saying point out that a slave couldn't actually choose their freedom anyway. And if they were set free, they couldn't choose to stay as a slave. They didn't have those choices available to them. So it can't be about choosing freedom, but it's about using their position as a slave. But there's a third reading, a middle reading, that I think that makes the most sense, which focuses neither on freedom nor on slavery, but on calling. And Paul is saying something like this. He's saying, even if the possibility exists of becoming free, focus rather on starting to make a positive use of your current situation. In this, changing the situation isn't the primary concern because you'll have other worries in whatever situation you end up in, presumably. Historical records show that many former slaves lived in worse conditions after they were freed than they did in slavery. So I think that Paul is saying that if you can't begin to learn to become a disciple of Jesus in your current circumstance, you are going to be no further along in maturity if your situation were to change. But if you try to change your situation, it's more likely to enslave you to the pursuit of that thing, whether it be power or status or recognition or something else that you desire. Some people say that by not speaking against slavery but using it as an example, it shows that Paul condoned slavery. But I think this is a crazy thing to say if you think about it. The main thing Paul says here in regard to slavery is that slaves are no less accepted by God than persons born free. And that social status or position is of no major importance and no eternal significance in Christ. So don't pursue status, he's saying. To say this, that slaves were equal to free-born people, was completely countercultural. But Paul goes further than this. In verse 22, he reverses the status of slave and free. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. And the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. It is actually this teaching that eventually meant that slavery was, as an accepted institution, it fell apart. It was out of this approach that the idea arose in society at all that treating someone else's property and owning another person was wrong. Because Paul here is effectively telling slave owners that their slaves are equal to them in the sight of God and they should treat them as such. And in fact, all Christians are slaves of Christ, who himself came in the form of a slave. F.F. Bruce says, what Paul's letters do is to bring us into an atmosphere in which the institution of slavery could only wilt and die. Paul's point is that the gospel is lived through earthly constraints, not in spite of them. And so we should make sure that we are living by the right set of constraints. Being a bondservant of Jesus is not only a higher status than a free person, but enables a person to live in such a way that any circumstance is one in which they can grow as a person in the household of God. You were bought at a price into this household. So Paul says, don't become slaves of human beings. And he finishes by repeating this central call, brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. So how is Paul using these two examples in his bigger discussion about marriage and singleness? I think that he is trying to say that while your marital status does define you socially, it does define you socially, whether you're single or married or separated or divorced, but it does not define your ability to be a disciple of Jesus. In our society, the status of being married is seen as higher than being single. We've witnessed this in our marriage debates over the past few years. People want not only equality of rights, because equality of rights were already available, but equality of social standing that the institution of marriage brings. And Paul is saying, coming to Christ reorders social priorities and concern for such things. With him you have a higher status than you'll ever have without him. You're an heir of his eternal kingdom. And second, he's saying, stop pursuing social rights to a degree that it distracts from living as a disciple in the situation you are now in. Don't use social measures when thinking about your discipleship. Don't think that by changing your status, you'll be a better disciple or have a better life even. These verses directly confront the individualism of our culture, which says that we should never be content with the status we have, but always seek more of whatever it is we don't yet have enough of, money or power or influence or rights. Paul's drive is that what's important is not the situation you're in, but how you live in that situation. Many people live their lives waiting for their circumstances to change, waiting for the next thing, waiting to finish school or to finish study or to get married or to have a child or for the kids to leave or to retire or to get to heaven. That's not discipleship in the present. That's living in the future. Some of us believe the lie that when our circumstances change, we'll be in a better position to do the very thing that God is calling us to do right now. I can't be generous with what I have because I don't have very much. When I earn more, then I'll be generous. If you're not practicing generosity when you have little, you will not when you have much. Well, I can't control my sexual urges now, but when I find a wife or a husband, that'll be solved. It won't be solved because marriage doesn't solve it. I can't be content as I am, but if someone chooses me, I'll overcome my insecurities or my loneliness, and companionship with a spouse will solve my issues with contentment. It just isn't true. I'm not to say that we should squash or ignore our desires or stay in situations either as helpless victims or in stubborn piety. Don't hear me saying that you need to submit to whatever situation you were in as a helpless victim. I'm saying the opposite of that. It's recognizing the power you have because of your status in Christ. And the thing that will bring the most out of life and enable you to see other choices as they arise is to willingly learn from your Master everything that he would teach you right here where you are now. To be a disciple is to recognize that every single present circumstance we are in brings its own opportunities and difficulties for living out the gospel in the way that I approach God, the way I approach other people, and the life that I'm in at the moment. I remember when I was in a difficult place a number of years ago. It was a place that I didn't like and I didn't want to be, and a place I didn't know how to move through. And I went to a mentor of mine to chat about it. And I spoke about what was happening and how I felt hurt and how I felt it was unfair and how things needed to change. And he sat with me and he listened to me. And you know, I wanted him to agree with me that this was unfair and that I had a right to feel this way. But instead he asked me a question that would actually help me to thrive in this place that I didn't want to be. And he asked me this question. He said, what is God wanting you to learn that where you are right now is the best place to learn it? Well, I didn't know, because my focus was on what other people were or weren't doing. My focus was on how to get out of my circumstance. I was looking at where I wasn't instead of where I was. And only when I turned to ask God what he wanted to teach me where I was, only then was I able to learn and grow through the difficulty of the situation. Discipleship is active, it's not passive. It's a journey, not an arrival. It's a process of learning, not a status you achieve. And the reality is that you likely won't be in the same place for the rest of your life. Slaves in the Roman world were slaves for an average of 7 years before they purchased their freedom or their master granted their freedom. But even if this is where you will remain, your freedom won't be found in your situation, but in how you approach it. The one who was a slave when called is the Lord's freed person. And the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. Some think of becoming a slave to Christ, it sounds like it's a place of bondage, that he wants to control our lives. But it's not. That's the opposite of what it is. It's an invitation into his household, to learn from the way that he approaches every situation he is in. Look at the life of Jesus and you see him work through situations of limitation in God's freedom, not seeking to escape situations for something better. And this is what he calls each of us to learn this from him. Look at the language of call in this text. Paul uses the word 8 times. Each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Some of us see this and say, well, I don't know what he's called me to. And this is exactly Paul's point. That God's call here is not a call to a particular vocation or worldly status. It's about a call to himself. So that out of that relationship we can learn to serve in any situation. The call is to live faithfully in the circumstance you are in right now. So where are you now? God has called you and enabled you to be a disciple right there. Look, you may not have chosen this place. It may not have turned out to be what you'd imagined it to be. It may not be where you want to be. But what does Jesus want to teach you where you are right now? My prayer is that we, as those who are invited into his household, might be those type of people who learn from him what he teaches us right where we are.